Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be looking at a game from 2015 Qatar Masters Open section between Mamedyarov with the white pieces, who was 2748 rating at the time, and our world champion Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces, who was 2834 at the time. And this is primarily a lesson about the pros and cons of the isolated pawn. So let's get started. The game started out d4 from Mamedyarov, knight f6 from Carlsen, c4, e6. A very flexible move order, just for you newer chess players out there. From here, the game can go into Queen's Indian defense, Queen's Gambit decline, Benoni, Bogo Indian. There's plenty of choices for black here, and this is one of the reasons why this move order is preferred, as opposed to, say, just d4 and d5 right away. And for instance, knight f3, say e6, c4, and knight f6. There's less flexibility there, as you already have committed your pawn to d5. But after knight f6, c4, e6, many players prefer Nimzo Indian after knight c3, and then they can play bishop b4. However, white does not have to allow black that possibility and can play moves like g3, leading to the Catalan, or as in the game, knight f3. This puts the ball back in black's court, so to speak, and now black can play a number of moves here, like c5, which would lead to Benoni if white chooses to play d5. d5 can be played, and also bishop b4 check, leading to what is called the Bogo Indian, which is named after famous Grandmaster Bogo. So anyway, knight f3 was played, and let me not forget, one of the main battlegrounds for many years, the Queen's Indian defense, favorite of Anatoly Karpov, Michael Adams. So this had to be mentioned, all with the same idea, fighting for this e4 square. However, the Queen's Indian is falling out of favor nowadays, and d5 is played. Carlsen plays knight c3, and there's still many continuations for black at this point. c5 can be played, going into a Tarish or semi-Tarish type setups. Bishop e7, even knight bd7 is possible. Carlsen chooses bishop b4. This is known as the Ragozin system or Ragozin complex, and it's named after Grandmaster Vyacheslav Ragozin, who was one of Botvinnik's assistants. Now, Alexander Alekhine, former world champion, had an interesting thing to say, a comment rather, to say about this move when he was observing a game between Capablanca and, forgive me because I can't remember who the opponent was. And it was in the 1924 tournament though. And what he said about this move, bishop b4, was that he basically felt that it was incorrect due to the fact that white can play the move queen a4 check, of course attacking, threatening to win the bishop, and after knight c6, black does not have adequate support in the center and cannot counterattack the center of white effectively. And this kind of put a knock on this system for a long time. And he even went on to play it himself later on and felt that although it's not absolutely 100% correct, that black does have chances against inferior play against white. And this is one of those openings, specifically talking about the black side, that you see from time to time between top level grandmasters. You don't see it as often, but you do see it from time to time. And I think that is the consensus today, is that the opening is not a 100% correct, that this bishop move may be a bit premature, but or not as solid rather, but it is playable, and the position is hard for white to break down. So, needless to say, um, Magnus played it, and he's a world champion, and therefore this has a stamp or some stamp of approval there. So Mamedyarov opted for bishop g5 instead of queen a5, queen a4 check, excuse me. So you'll see the idea behind this move. After h6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. Black gives up the bishop pair immediately, so we can already see that there are some imbalance is in a position, and black has the bishop pair here. And white's idea is basically going to be to orchestrate an attack on the king side and exploit the appearance of the queen on f6 at some point, gaining time in support of that attack. So let's see how it worked out. So e3, castle, rook c1, typical queen's gambit type move, putting pressure down the c file, hoping to um, win the c pawn, right? D takes c4, bishop takes c4. And so what we see here is black has allowed white, or helped facilitate white's development, or lead in development rather, in exchange for a solid, very solid pawn structure and position here. How did he facilitate white's lead in development? Well, h6, right, attacking the bishop when it was on g5, it captured. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and yes, the queen is technically developed there, but it's in a vulnerable position where it will lose tempi. So facilitates white's development and allow white to gain time. And the other move was by capturing on c4, d takes c4. So we can see here that white has a pawn preponderance in the center, right? Having pawns in the E and D files, as opposed to white only having one pawn on the E file. White also has the open C file. So white has a good position. In exchange, black does have the two bishops, and he has a very solid pawn structure, which will be hard for white to break. So white's strategy going forward is to use his lead in development and try to transfer it into something more tangible. For instance, weakness, create weakness in black's camp. c5, this is what black is playing for in these type of setups. The c pawn can become a liability, and also it's good to get rid of it and use it to attack and break down the formidable white center. Mamedyarov castles, and now c takes d4. Now a big decision has to be made. How does black capture here? Excuse me, how does white capture? He has several choices. They're all pretty respectable. One choice is just knight takes d4, and I don't like this move, knight c6, but I'll show it to you because it just creates weakness. But at the same time, it does allow maybe some future for this bishop. But this is not a move I recommend, but I just want to show you that with the knight on d4, it can be difficult for black to develop properly. And this is a nice little target for white to be able to focus on. But instead of a move like knight c6, simply rook d8. This is a move I would play, lining up against the queen. I like doing moves like that. Of course, the queen moves with a threat against the bishop. And let's say bishop e7 and rook fd1. We can see that it's a little problematic for black to develop. Even though he has a solid position, it's just the space advantage in the position of white's pieces that black has to be very careful. For instance, just putting his knight on c6 allows this pawn situation which he doesn't want to have. So that means he probably has to come to knight d7, but then knight e4 happens. So and there's a tempi on the queen that I spoke about. So capturing with the knight is not too bad. Black definitely would have to be careful after knight takes d4. Rook d8, queen b3, and maybe more modest. Maybe some. I'm sorry, not b6. Maybe just capturing this piece right here, and say after rook takes c3, b6, rook fd1, bishop b7, and I think that's a more sound approach here by black. And then say, for example, let's say bishop b5, just with the idea of working on the c6 square. Basically, white is working on the penetration of the c file. That's basically all he has going from at this point. So I think black is just fine here. And let's say after knight a6, then all white really can do to try to go for an advantage is to play bishop takes a6, bishop takes a6, and then perhaps try to penetrate into the black camp. And I think again black is just fine here. So knight d4 is one way to take. The other way is queen takes d4, which again leads to analogous lines but without the queens. So attacking player that he is, Mamedyarov, chose to take with nothing and play knight e4, gaining a tempo on the queen. That was just a temporary thing, but Carlsen is forced to move his queen, and the knight moves a little closer to the king side, and that's what he wants to do. Now, how does he capture? Did he take with the knight? Nope. He took with the pawn. Now here is interesting also because there's a couple of moves that can be done in between. For instance, a3, attacking the bishop, forcing the bishop to determine its location. The bishop at this point with the knight on e4 might not want to go here or here because it'll get traded off, and that's one of black's assets is having a bishop here. So that shows that bishop a5 would probably be the best move. And then say after knight takes d4, white has a good position. But again, the symmetrical nature of the position, seems kind of drawers, but white definitely has pressure because of this space advantage. Anyway, Mamedyarov took with the pawn and went into the isolated pawn scenario. So let's take a second and speak on the isolated pawn. Okay, now of course in the olden days of Tarish and Rubinstein, it was generally accepted that the isolated pawn was weak, and the reason for that was because the isolated pawn is cut off from other pawns. As you can see in this position on c3 and e3, there's nothing supporting the isolated pawn, so therefore it must be protected by pieces. And therefore the basic strategy that would come to your mind is that black should be trying to exchange pieces as the game goes along, because it only makes sense that if the isolated pawn can only be protected by pieces, then if you get rid of the pieces that are defending it, then the pawn itself will become vulnerable and eventually be captured. So that's a main principle that was determined back then and is still valid today. So just to consolidate and reiterate that when you have the isolated pawn, when you don't have the isolated pawn, then you want to try to exchange as many pieces as you can, because with few pieces left on the board, the isolated pawn must be protected, and so it becomes a major weakness. Okay, now on the flip side of the coin, if you have the isolated pawn, you want to keep your pieces, and this is general, of course, you have to calculate, but in general, when you have the isolated pawn, you want to keep the pieces on the board. You want to be active, because you can launch a kingside attack or make a powerful break in the center. Okay, now so rook d8 is played by Carlsen. Now why did he play rook d8? Well, he's attacking the isolated pawn. Now white wants to conduct a kingside attack here, and white wants to be able to push this pawn to d5 and explode black center. And one of the ideas behind attacking the pawn on d4 is that if you attack it, it has to be defended by pieces, and if the white pieces are defending, then they cannot attack. And so basically white's pieces are tied up or become tied up. So now to get more specific, when you play against the isolated pawn, as you see Magnus Carlsen doing, and you can follow the rest of the moves of this game, one, you want to have control over the d5 square, and in an ideal scenario you would love to have it occupied by the knight, or by a knight rather, blockading so that the pawn has no chance of advancing. Besides the pawn not having a chance of advancing, it becomes a weakness, because once the pawn becomes immobile, then it can be attacked. Another strategy is that sometimes g6 is played to protect the king, to stop the threats along the b1 h7 diagonal, because many times there'll be scenarios where the queen will end up on d3 and the bishop will end up on c2, creating a battery, checkmate battery back here. So a lot of times g6 is played. And what's interesting about that is, you notice early in the game, Mamedyarov traded his bishop on f6. He provoked h6. So one, he gets rid of one of these knights that could have possibly occupied d5, because many times black would like to play knight b d7, knight b6, right, looking at d5, and then in conjunction with a knight on f6, he have the two knights working together to block d5. So that's part of the strategy. In case you were wondering, why did White give up his bishop pair so early? Is one, he gets rid of one of these potential blockaders on d5. He also gets rid of a defender on the king side, and he also provokes some weakness over here for later on, because now g6 leave this h pawn even weaker, and the king side weaker in general. Okay, now let's look at the other side. Now, when you have the isolated pawn, understand the benefits of the isolated pawn, and you'll know what you should be doing. Okay, first of all, the isolated pawn gives you great outpost here and control over the c5 and e5 square. As you can see, I'm placing these knights here. These are the benefits of having the isolated pawn, is that increased control of the center. Increased control of the center gives you more activity. Notice also that breakthrough is possible. This is a major strategic threat in isolated pawn positions, as White loves to get this move in and blow up the center, and opens up f7 and e6 for the bishop that's here, and sometimes there's knights here on g5 or f4 and sacrifice on these squares. Another main idea is the king side attack possibility, and again I just mentioned that, alluding to it with the sacrifices on f7, e6 will occur. Also notice the open files that are created by having the isolated pawn, because for instance, if this pawn on d4 was protected with the pawn on c3, no open file. But since the pawn is isolated, you have possibilities of the rook either coming up on the c file or coming up on the c file to the third rank and then transferring over. Check that out, to the king side. And you have the same option on the e file. Again, if there's a pawn here and pawn here on f2 and e3, nowhere for the rook to go. But here you have ideas of rook e1. Of course not now because the bishop is right there, but rook e1, again, being able to maneuver. Third rank, same thing. So we can deduce from that the isolated pawn facilitates activity of pieces, and this is the lure of the isolated pawn for a lot of players, is that yes, they're taking on a static weakness, but they can be play actively. And so even though your main idea is to attack on the king side, you can also attack on the queen side and get good play over there as well, and along the e file. So activity is your theme. If you have the isolated pawn, activity, trying to keep the pieces on the board, creating threats, and trying to break through the black position. So now, with that in mind, we can understand what both players are trying to do here. So rook d8, putting pressure on the pawn, tying White's pieces down to the defense. Queen e2, just simply connecting these rooks and getting out of the path of this rook. You don't want to be lined up with your queen, and your opponent to line up his rook with your queen like that. Knight c6, actually threatening to win the pawn here. Now we have the knight and rook there. Rook fd1. So you see what I'm saying about the pieces have to defend the pawn, and when they're defending, they can't really attack. But Mamedyarov is playing well, because even though he's defending, his moves are good moves. In other words, like later on, perhaps this rook can still go to the third rank and transfer over. So even when making defensive moves, it's good if you can make it a multi-purpose move. basically a defensive move that has a little uh, venom or attacking possibilities in it. So bishop a5, and if you've been paying attention in the last couple of minutes, you know where that bishop is going. Knight g3, again setting up king side attacking possibilities. Ideas of here later on. Knight h4, say combined with queen g4. Bishop b6, again simple. Just keep piling up on the d pawn. Again, piece is forced to um, come to the aid. And notice again, I was saying combine your moves. Defense is it's a defensive move, but there's also a bit of venom in there. In this case, the idea of playing bishop d3 and checkmate. And those are the type of moves you want to play. While if you must defend, you want to try to, get that poison in there also. And notice too, bishop d7 and rook a8, or bishop c8 and rook a8. So for all of black's solidity in the position, the space advantage of white is making it difficult for him to unravel. So you have to be prepared to play these kind of games if you you know allow your opponent, if your opponent has an isolated pawn. So Carlsen is very patient. He plays bishop d7, h4. So Mamedyarov decides it's time to start attacking. Bishop e8, and these are just cold precision moves by Carlsen. He's not panicking. He's just putting his pieces in the most optimal squares. He has three pieces attacking the pawn. He moves this bishop out of the way, connects the rooks, so this rook can get into play. And the bishop is not too good right now, but so he uses it for defensive purposes. a3, and this probably has an idea of keeping the piece off of b4, and even some lines expanding later on to remove this knight from attacking the isolated pawn. Rook d6, great move here by Carlsen. Queen g4. So we see the battle and contrast of ideas. Mamedyarov he wants to play here and checkmate white. Checkmate black, and Carlsen wants to just win that pawn. And so now you have four pieces attacking that pawn. d5. So there's the break. So now this move is either going to make or break white here, because it's either correct and it's going to blow up black's position, or it's wrong and it's going to backfire. So let's see what happened here. Obviously, if takes, right, we would love to take. Knight f5, powerful move, which I believe gives white the advantage here. After queen f6, again the mate is threatened, because there's a couple of threats here. It's not just mate and the threat that win the exchange, but also this move can be played also. This knight takes. So this is not a move that you want to allow here. So queen f6, knight takes, rook takes. This move is cold right here, because now if he tries to take this bishop, then just simply queen takes d6. So that's the main idea of d5. However, one of the defects that I saw right away looking at this game is that these two rooks here on the back rank, the position of them makes it impossible for white to capture anything, because black would simply just capture twice on d1. So that makes this kind of like a false threat here, like a bluff almost. And this gives black the time he needs, because now this pawn is kind of stuck here because it can't move. It's pinned. And remember what I said, once the pawn gets fixed, then it can be attacked. And so it's kind of like black attacked the pawn on d4 so many times, and it moved to d5, and it's kind of like just lost now. So let's see what happens. So queen f8, queen f8, just consolidating, protecting the king side against any hocus pocus like that. But there's a strong idea behind them. You see, he's vacated the e7 square. So now queen e4 is played. And queen e4 is simply designed to maintain the pawn, to maintain the material equality if Carlsen was to capture. And Carlsen is probably a little bit better here, but the game would be drawish. But Carlsen played knight e7 instead, building up the pressure, because remember, this pawn can't move because of the capture on d1. So Mamedyarov decides to threaten mate instead. So he plays bishop d3. So now surely black cannot capture the pawn because it would be checkmate. So this forces a key move in the position. f5. And this refutes white's play for all intents and purposes. So after f5, queen is hit, queen a5, and the pawn simply meets an inglorious ending after knight takes d5. So all of that build up, and then he simply just lost the pawn. Even stronger than that, the knight takes d5 with knight g6. And this is all about, after queen e1, queen f6, attacking this pawn right here and attacking this pawn. And this pawn is still under pressure, because it's all about the fact that this pawn cannot move, because in this case now the bishop would be captured on d3. But Magnus played in a real practical manner. Knight takes d5, just went in the pawn. And then here, Mamedyarov kind of got desperate and played bishop takes f5, which is based on a miscalculation. And after e takes f5, knight takes f5 was played. Attacking the rook. And his idea is, after a move like rook 6 to d7, right, just moving back, that he would just simply capture this rook. Rook takes d5, with the further idea, rook takes d5 and knight e7 check. And all of a sudden, white is better. Right? All of a sudden, white is up material and better. That was Mamedyarov's idea, his hope for the position. In other words, in his mind, in his brain, his neurons connected and said that Carlsen will play rook 6 to d7, and then he'll play rook takes d5, rook takes d5, knight e7, king h8, and knight d5, and he'll be winning. It's funny how our brains work too, because often we see combinations like in the most optimistic way. Like we don't think about the defense being like, we don't make the defense real strong. We It's kind of like we take the easiest path in our minds, and that leads to a lot of miscalculation. Because we don't think high enough of the defense. We make the strongest move on our side, but then we make a weak move in calculating what the defense would be. So after knight takes f5, what would your defense be here? Or would you defend anything at all? And I just want to show you, for example, in that line, after rook 6 d7, rook takes d5, Carlsen doesn't even have to play rook takes d5. He could just attack the knight twice here. And after rook takes d7, rook takes d7, knight e3, and white has an advantage in this position also. So that's what he was banking on. However, Mamedyarov missed a real simple move here, and rook c6, and he resigned. The game is over. Nothing works now. Nothing works. So for example, rook takes d5, and you see that rook on c1 all alone, about to be captured. And if rook takes c6, then simply pawn takes c6. And this leaves white down severely in material. So he resigned instead of trying to play on against the world champion. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that game, and I hope you learned something about the pros and cons of isolated pawns. So don't think that they're just bad just because they appear on the board, or even because Mamedyarov lost this game. The isolated pawn is just another aspect of chess, and depending on the position, it could be good and it could be bad. So if you like active games and you like your pieces to have a lot of squares to go to, and freedom of movement, and don't like cramped positions, try playing positions with the isolated pawn sometimes. Okay? Alright, I'll see you on the next one. And please like and subscribe. I forgot to say that. Alright,